And I'd like to extend a special welcome to those people joining us via the webcast. My name is Charles Baer, and I'm the director of the Rotman Institute of Philosophy at Western University. The Rotman Institute is where philosophers engage scientists to make a difference in the world. Each year, the Rotman Institute of Philosophy selects an outstanding scholar in the ethics and epistemology of contemporary science to be the Rotman Institute Lecturer in philosophy and science and give 2 public lectures at Western University. Previous recipients of this honor include William Wimsatt from the University of Chicago and Phil Kitcher from Columbia University. I'm very pleased to say that this year's recipient is Professor Nancy Cartwright from the London School of Economics and the University of California, San Diego. Her lecture today addresses evidence, argument, and mixed methods. Her second lecture on wiser use of social science, wiser wishes, wiser policies will be delivered tomorrow starting at 3:30 p.m. in this room. So I invite you all to attend tomorrow's lecture as well. Nancy Cartwright is Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method in the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, San Diego. She received her PhD in philosophy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Professor Cartwright's research is broadly situated in philosophy and history of science, and her work on modeling, causal inference, evidence, and objectivity has been highly influential in the field. She is the author of a number of widely read books. I'll just name a few. How the Laws of Physics Lie, published by Oxford University Press in 1983. The Doubtful World, a study of the boundaries of science, published by Cambridge University Press in 1999. And Hunting Causes and Using Them, Studies in Philosophy and Economics, published by Cambridge in 2007. She's also a leader in thinking about how philosophy of science can contribute to effective public policy. She's currently writing a book with Jeremy Hardy entitled Evidence-Based Policy, Doing a Better Practical Guide Predicting if a Policy Will Work for You, with Oxford. Professor Cartwright is the recipient of numerous professional honors. She is a fellow of the British Academy, a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the German Academy of Sciences. And she's also a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship. She's also recently president of the Philosophy of Science Association and of the American Philosophical Association Pacific Division. It's a great pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. And everyone, please join me in welcoming the 2011-2012 Rotman Institute Lecturer in Philosophy and Science, Professor Nancy Cartwright.
It's a great pleasure to be back at Western after a long time, to see old friends and to meet and make some new ones. And I'm particularly proud to be able to give the Rotman lectures. I'm very committed to and interested in the kinds of things that the Institute is dedicated to. So I think it's a good fit and an honor to be here. Now, whether you are in Canada or the USA, the UK or the World Bank, or increasingly in other parts of the world, if you are a policymaker, you will be urged, indeed, you're often mandated to pursue evidence-based policy. As a recent report commissioned for what's called DFID, the UK Department for International Development, a recent report explains, the search for what works, hence for a demonstration of causal bases of interventions for the production of desired effects, is at the basis of the movement for evidence-based policy, which is always abbreviated EBP. This movement argues that policymakers should take decisions based on evidence rather than on ideology or in response to special interests. The movement arose out of twin concerns. First, that systematic knowledge and analysis was often not utilized by policymakers. And second, that policymakers had no way of judging the trustworthiness of the findings with which they were bombarded by academics, pressure groups, and lobbyists. Related ideas have inspired other rationalist governance reforms, or not reforms, of the late 20th century, including new public management, results-based management, and of course, evaluation more generally. However, the origins of EBP were medical, or more specifically, based on protocols for assuring drug trials. This goes some way to explaining the particular approach to judging causality through experiments that EBP and advocates of first-generation impact evaluation favored. The EBP movement started from two main assumptions. First, it is assumed that there are only some specific methods that can rigorously produce evidence of the efficacy of policy interventions. These superior methods, described by proponents as gold standard, and coming from the biomedical tradition, favor randomized controlled trials, both as a way of answering questions of attribution, but also as a foundation for generalization through the synthesis of the results of separate experiments. The second assumption was that once policymakers are confronted with high-quality evidence of impact, they will be more willing to use that evidence and take on board the lessons of systematic research or evaluation. Understanding what works and what does not, then, feeds into a process of learning and the improvement of policy. That's what the report for difference says. Oops. Now, if evidence is going to play this crucial role in improving policy, we had better be clear just what evidence is. That's what this talk is about. I will focus on effectiveness predictions for illustration. Predictions that a well-defined policy will produce a targeted outcome here for us if we implement it. Randomized controlled trials, RCTs, not rational choice theory, but randomized controlled trials is RCT tonight. Randomized controlled trials are, as the different report says, touted as gold standard evidence for such claims. But there is a catch. One, the evidence-based policy movement itself worries about. And I'm quoting, there's a risk that with the concentration on or assumed superiority of experimental or quasi-experimental methods, those types of interventions not suitable for these approaches will come to be considered less effective or somehow inferior and therefore less value for money. So it is asked, can this question, this risk that I've just mentioned, always gives rise to the following question. It is asked, can non-experimental and qualitative evidence support effectiveness claims? How and how strongly? And how do we combine qualitative and quantitative results to arrive at good predictions? I shall argue that this way of raising the questions grossly misjudges the need for mixed methods and the role they play. I propose we start by asking what makes RCTs evidence for effectiveness? What makes them evidence at all? What I shall do here is to provide an answer to this question. That is, I am going to propose a theory of evidence, a theory of what makes a fact evidence, one fact evidence for another, or a claim evidence for a hypothesis. This theory goes by the label, this theory goes by the label the argument account of evidence. I note from the start that evidence is not a natural kind. There is no correct theory of what evidence is, as there might, for instance, be a correct theory of what an electron is. When this is the case, our account of what makes for a good theory should be responsive to what needs the theory addresses. The theory I propose started as a theory of evidence for use, in particular for use in making reliable predictions, especially predictions about what results will be produced by actions we consider taking. The argument account is not confined to this context, however, but should fit anywhere we face similar needs. A central problem I see everywhere that evidence-based policy is on the tapestry is that the way the term evidence is usually used lets in far too much. And it does so while at the same time purporting to be very restrictive by subscribing to the highest standards of rigor. In response, the argument theory of evidence is demanding. That's because it is commonly, and I think reasonably supposed, that a piece of evidence for a hypothesis should weigh in, either positively or negatively, in judging the truth of that hypothesis. And a genuinely new piece of evidence should, ceteris paribus, add to the weight on one side or the other. It is with this in mind that I offer stringent criteria. I want criteria such that once a fact meets those criteria, we should be happy to allow it to weigh in. My criteria rule out as evidence much that is currently lauded in evidence-based policy discussions. And that is all to the good, I shall argue. Now, for evidence about the truth of a hypothesis, we need true claims that speak for or against the hypothesis. And then to use these claims as evidence in evaluating the hypothesis, we need to know how loudly they speak. Standard evidence-based policy treats of 1 and 3. Do we have number 3 up there? Yes. Standard evidence-based policy treats of 1 and 3, but little of 2. And there's the trouble. Here's an example. Oh, there's the trouble. Here's an example. One of the better ones. A guide to evidence quality constructed by GRADE, the Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation Working Group, and used by over 50 organizations worldwide. You can see by inspection that the grading is for judgments about 1. How likely is a possible evidence claim to be true? That goes by the name evidence quality. And notice RCT's rule. Next, look at how GRADE proposes to use these judgments of evidence quality to make recommendations about health interventions. Can you see? I hope I couldn't figure out how to make it any larger and still get everything in. If you read the red circle bits, you'll see that there will be a strong recommendation for an intervention. That is, presumably, it's taken to be that the hypothesis that the intervention will produce the targeted results is likely to be true. There will be a strong recommendation for an intervention when we can be certain about the effects of the intervention. We can be certain about the effects when there is high-quality evidence, and we have high-quality evidence if we have some good RCTs. Okay. Here's another from the U.S. Department of Education. You have good evidence that a program will work in your school if there are 2 or more successful RCTs in schools like yours. And what advice do you get about whether a school is like yours? Here's all they say, if you look through the entire document. Trials on white suburban populations do not constitute strong evidence for large inner-city schools serving primarily minority students. So that's it. This is the context that leads me to want a theory of evidence for use. Everywhere, we are urged that RCTs provide good evidence for predicting that policies will work for us. Exactly when is this true? When is it true that they will provide good evidence? I believe, however, that the argument account is a good theory to take up far more widely than this because it creates the right demands that a claim should meet before it is allowed to weigh in for or against a hypothesis. Here are the 2 central tenets of the argument theory. If you aren't doing arguments, you aren't doing warrant. And evidence equals facts reported in good arguments. I also insist it's not evidence unless there's evidence, it's evidence. Normally I say it ain't evidence unless there's evidence, it's evidence. But I thought I should even lecture. Now, knowledge claims are warranted by good arguments. Arguments that are both valid and sound. Sorry. Valid equals that the conclusions genuinely follow from the premises, and sound equals the premises are true. Evidence, then, is a three-place relation. E is evidence for H relative to a specific argument A for H. So, a well-established claim, E, is evidence for hypothesis H relative to argument A, or relative to a sequence of arguments, if and only if E is a necessary premise in A, which is a good argument for H, or E is a necessary premise in A prime, which is a good argument for a premise and a good argument A for H, or ... Now, this requirement may seem excessively strong, but what's to be afraid of? That it will then become apparent how much else must be in place if E is to favor the truth of H? I think hiding what's required is intellectually and morally culpable. If the remaining facts must be laid out explicitly as premises in the argument, then we can see and evaluate just how strong E's claim to speak about the truth of H is. Once we see what these additional premises are, we can then ask the vital question: what's the warrant for these premises? I thus see the need to evaluate strength of warrant entering at three stages in assessing a hypothesis. First, what is the warrant that the claims offered in evidence are true? Two, what is the warrant that these are indeed evidence for the hypothesis? And three, what is the warrant for the hypothesis in view of the body of evidence on offer? The body of putative evidence on offer. It's because of two, the need for warrant that what we offer as evidence deserves that label, that I urge it's not evidence till there's evidence, it's evidence. I stress the importance of arguments because arguments, like chains, are only as strong as their weakest link. A valid argument with 9 premises true and 1 false does not make its conclusion 90% probable. So a body of evidence that nails down 9 of the premises is not enough for high warrant. Indeed, if the 10th premise is known to be false, the argument is no good at all. And what's been offered as evidence is irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion. Mystery stories provide good examples of the importance of each and every premise throughout the argument structure. And it's good that I can say this because I deduct all the mystery stories I buy from my American income tax on the grounds that I'm doing research. So, mystery stories provide good examples of the importance of each and every premise throughout the argument structure. Consider Freeman Will's props, Inspector French, who is always at pains to lay out clearly the arguments that support his conclusions. Inspector French has become convinced, on the basis of a body of seemingly good evidence, that Carey murdered accurately. We can reconstruct his warrant for this in a form I advocate, that of an argument with explicit premises and explicit sub-premises, diagrammed in what I call an argument pyramid. So here's the argument pyramid for French's case. Premise 1 in French's argument concerns motive. Accurately, French argued, had cottoned on to a major fraud that Carey was involved in. This was backed by compelling evidence for 3 claims. Fraud had been committed, Accurately had raised suspicions about it, and Carey was responsible for the fraud. This last, that Carey was responsible for the fraud, was supported by evidence that Carey was in a position to perpetrate the fraud, that he had income otherwise unaccounted for, and, very importantly, that he had committed suicide when it looked as if the fraud might be revealed, despite Ackley's death. So that's part of the story. Now, there was equally good evidence for premise 2, concerning opportunity. Carey could have committed the murder. I won't tell the whole story. The check marks in the figure mean that French had good reasons to back his claim about Carey's opportunity. But opportunity and motive by themselves do not support a conclusion of guilt. French, though, had a third premise. Premise 3 laid out the method. This was a step-by-step narrative of how Carey was supposed to have carried out the murder. The narrative was supported by good evidence that Carey was at some of the right places at the right times. And French had established by timing distances and estimating speeds, Carey could have been at the other places in the chain when needed. French had a way to fill in all the boxes in the argument pyramid, all the way down. I won't do so since the details don't matter here. Together, French's three major premises made a compelling argument for Carey's guilt. Then, it was revealed that Carey had not committed suicide, but rather was murdered. French immediately reported to his superior. Here is a record of their conversation, beginning with a question from French's superior. This is just from Paul's book. His superior. This is going to be an upset to your theory, Inspector? French nodded. Complete. I've got to start from the beginning again. Is it as bad as that? I think so. This murder of Carey makes it unlikely that he killed Ackerley, and if he didn't kill Ackerley, the whole of my theory goes west. So the whole theory falls. There's no longer compelling reason to think that Carey murdered Ackerley. But what about all that evidence that French had so painstakingly gathered? Well, it was no longer evidence that Carey was the killer. The suicide was an essential prop for the assumption that Carey was responsible for the fraud. Without the suicide, the other evidence was far too weak to justify that assumption. But without it, premise one fails. Motive is not established. And without motive, opportunity and the existence of a possible method for carrying out the murder provide weak warrant, if any at all, that Carey was the murderer. It is still possible that he was guilty, but French no longer has evidence to support that. Evidence is a three-place relation. The measurements of distances and times are evidence of Carey's guilt, yes, but only relative to French's entire argument. When one of the necessary premises in that argument fails, those measurements are no longer evidence at all. As French says, the whole of his theory goes west, as we see in the diagram here. Okay, so that's an illustration of the argument theory of evidence and how it works. There are a few objections philosophers may have right away to the argument theory of evidence, the argument account of evidence. None, I urge, undermine the account. So here's one. On this account, the job of warranting that a claim is evidence can never be finished, right? Because doing so requires warranting that the claim is a necessary part of a good argument. To know the argument is good, you need warrant for the other premises. To warrant those premises, you need a good argument. To warrant that these arguments are good, you need warrant for the premises in them, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. Now, that does not seem to me to be a problem. It's what honest evaluation requires. Of course, we do stop somewhere. We have to. You will notice that there are roots growing out of the bottom boxes in the diagram of French's argument pyramid. The roots indicate that those claims can be taken as well established, at least for the nonce. To the extent that our stopping points are not ones we can take for granted, at least for the nonce, we must be wary of our conclusions. That's why, of course, it can be worthwhile to have a variety of different plausible defenses for the same conclusion. So that's one objection. Second one is that the argument account implies that anything is evidence for a logical truth, since anything, any claim at all, speaks for its truth. But admitting this does no harm. It's no harm, but still I wouldn't advise spending much to buy information about other facts to warrant a logical truth. If you know a claim is a logical truth, you don't need to buy information about other facts to warrant it. And if you don't know that the claim is a logical truth, you will have trouble warranting that the claim is implied by any old fact you buy. Still, if you don't know that H is a logical truth, I don't know, but I'm assured that if E then H, then E is surely worth learning. That's the third section. Or second, anyways. On to the next one. I don't have bullet points. I don't have numbers, so I've forgotten how many there are. Another possible objection is that everything is evidence for itself. That's okay. Any claim does speak for itself. But we know that the conclusions of arguments are no more warranted by the argument than the premises. So we won't be led astray here in evaluating the warrant for the claim. Another depends on, if you look at the structure of the examples I give, they're all deductive. Now, I give deductive arguments because they're personally the only ones where I understand a notion of validity that's well understood. But that's the fact that I think that all valid arguments are deductive arguments, I think, or I illustrate with deductive arguments, isn't central to the argument account of evidence. If you believe in other kinds of logics, that's fine. What is required is a logic with a clear sense of how premises bear on the truth of conclusions. Okay, now, if all arguments are deductive, then on the argument account, there's another possible objection, there can't be both evidence for a claim and evidence for its negation. But we typically do say, well, there's evidence for H, there's evidence for against H. If all arguments are deductive, then on the argument account, there can't be both evidence for a claim and evidence for its negation, since evidence claims must be able to participate in good deductive arguments. And there can't be good deductive arguments for a hypothesis and its negation, given how defined good as valid and sound. That's okay too. It can still be reasonable to say we have evidence for H and evidence for not H. We say that when there are results that can figure in plausible arguments for H and results that can figure in plausible arguments for its opposite. What matters is that we recognize that the results can only count as evidence relative to some good argument, so we don't just let the result weigh in without commitment to the existence of those arguments. Of course, if there are good arguments that are not deductive, and hence the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion, then it will be literally true on the argument account of evidence that there can be evidence for both H and evidence for not H. Enough on objections. Let me now provide an example. Another example besides the mystery stories. I choose one that answers the question that prompted my research on evidence. When is a positive RCT result on policy evidence that the policy will work here? On the argument account, a study result will be evidence if there's a good argument to connect it with a hypothesis. Now, I'm going to show you an argument that does this job for the RCT. I call it the effectiveness argument. The effectiveness argument is a special argument. Special because if its premises fail, then it would be a sheer accident if the policy delivered the same result here as in the study. So, imagine you have conducted a perfect RCT. Sorry? That's what I just claimed about the particular argument I'm going to show you. It's not only valid, but it's got this special nature that if its premises fail, it would be an accident if the policy delivered the same results here's in the study. So imagine you've conducted a perfect RCT. All the requirements for an ideal randomized controlled trial have been met. For instance, randomization has succeeded. You won't know this, but suppose you have conducted an ideal RCT, and the randomization has succeeded in ensuring that all causal factors other than the policy itself were equally distributed between treatment and control group. So you have, imagine you conducted an ideal RCT and you have correctly inferred that the average value of the outcome is bigger in the treatment group than in the control group. We say in this case that the policy has a positive effect size in the study. Adding some further fairly uncontroversial assumptions, it follows deductively that what I call the RCT result. The policy figures as a cause and the causal principle that governs the production of the outcome in the study population. Or it figures in the causal principle there. in the study. Now, good. I'm glad that this is what you can prove deductively follows from a positive result and an ideal, a positive effect size and an ideal RCT. Now, this result seems to me to be clearly irrelevant to the prediction that the policy will produce a positive effect size here, unless here and there share this causal principle. Or more precisely, the principle need not be entirely the same in the two situations. What's needed is that it figures in the causal principle here if it does so there. Or as I say, for shorthand, it plays the same causal role here as there. Well, that's not enough, however. No matter how much detail we put into the policy description, policies almost never produce effects on their own. Like any other causes, they need helping factors. Indeed, usually a whole team of them. For the philosophers in the audience, this is just the claim that causes are Inus conditions. Now here, so causes need helping factors. Indeed, usually a whole team of them. Here, for instance, is a cake chart from the work of Harris Cooper on what it takes for homework to improve test scores. Can you read that? Student, here's one cake of factors. If they're all present, homework can produce the required the expected contribution to test scores, but if any of them are missing, it won't do so. The point about these cakes is that all the ingredients in them are necessary. If any are missing, you don't get the expected outcome level. Of course, there can be more than one set of support factors that will make homework work, more than one cake, and there will also, most likely, be sets of factors that couple with homework to produce a negative outcome. For instance, if many of the positive factors shown here are missing, and students are also resentful and rebellious, they may perform worse if assigned homework. Now, the different participants in an RCT, randomized controlled trial, are differently endowed with these helping factors. Some will have a full set of ingredients from one positive cake or another. That means that you'll get a positive contribution there. Many will not have enough helping factors to make the policy work either positively or negatively. And others will have the ingredients of negative cakes, so that the policy produces negative results for them. These kinds of individuals will be distributed in the same way in the treatment and control groups in an ideal RCT. Okay, so you get a positive effect size in the RCT when there are enough individuals with positive support teams, that is, good cakes, to outweigh those with negative. You get negative effect size if the negative cakes dominate, and the effect is zero. The effect is zero if the two balance out. And of course, as I already said, the effect size is also zero if the policy plays no role in the causal principle governing the outcome in the study. So, what you learn from positive RCT results is that the policy plays a causal role there in the principle in the study population, and that there was a good distribution of helping factors there. Whereby good, I just mean the effects of the positive cakes outweighed those of the negative. So that's what you learn from an RCT, a positive effect size in an RCT, a positive outcome. When will this information matter to evaluating if the policy will work here? Consider, if you know the outcome in your situation is not governed by the same causal principles as there in the study, the results of the RCT should not weigh in for you at all. Nor should they if you know that the individuals here do not have the requisite helping factors. This is why I say evidence is a three-place relation. You can't just look at the result, or here's the result. You can't look at the result and the hypothesis. You can't look just at two of them and decide that the result is evidence for the hypothesis. Whether it is depends on what else is the case. The what else, I am arguing, is what is expressed in the other premises of a good argument for the hypothesis. So, following the brief analysis we just went through, here is the special argument that makes the information from an RCT result there relevant to predicting that a policy will work here. So here's the effectiveness argument. Premise 1, the policy plays a positive causal role in the principles that govern the effect there. And we get that from the RCT, an ideal, successful or ideal RCT. Second, the policy plays the same causal role here as there. Where do we get that from? And third, there's a good distribution of helping factors here. And again, where do we get that from? Therefore, the policy will produce a positive effect size here. The conclusion follows deductively. And here's an argument pyramid depicting this. We have a good argument, but only if the premises are true. If they are not, the argument collapses, just as French's did. Our warrant for taking the RCT result as evidence for our policy via this argument can be no greater than our warrant that the premises are true. And where can that warrant come from? I promised, zapping along here very well, I'll have a lot of time for discussion. I promised a discussion not just of argument and evidence, but of mixed methods. Now is the time for that discussion. Despite the strong movement advocating RCTs, and only RCTs, it is common both in philosophy and among practicing social scientists to urge that the warrant for hypothesis is stronger. The hypothesis is the more robust, is the term they choose. The hypothesis is more robust when the evidence is produced by a variety of different independent methods. The methods are independent when it is unlikely that whatever flaws they have would align in the right way to allow the methods to yield the same result if that was in all those studies, if that result were not correct. It's typical to use the language of triangulation here. Look, for instance, at the text Mixed Methodology, Combining Qualitative and Quantitative Approaches. It's a quote from this text. All of the mixed method designs use triangulation techniques. Methodological triangulation involves the use of both qualitative and quantitative methods and data to study the same phenomena with the same study or in different complementary studies. Look also to an article from an education evaluation journal. The core premise of triangulation as a design strategy is that all methods have inherent biases and limitations. So, use of only one method to assess the given phenomenon will inevitably yield biased and limited results. However, when two or more methods that have offsetting biases are used to assess a given phenomenon, and the results of these methods converge or corroborate one another, then the validity of inquiry findings is enhanced. This triangulation argument requires that the two or more methods be intentionally used to assess the same conceptual phenomenon, be therefore implemented simultaneously, and to preserve their counteracting biases also be implemented independently. Okay. So now there's currently, you probably all know this, a lively philosophical debate about exactly how triangulation works, or robustness, and what it can really do for us. I am not about to enter that debate. I want rather to point out that almost all these discussions of robustness, triangulation, and mixing methods are talking about what I call horizontal mixing. The different methods generally triangulate on one result narrowly conceived. That is made explicit in the bold-faced expressions in the quote here. And also in this diagram from another well-known methodology text. And again, I think that's just for the reasons that were described in the quote. How are biases to offset one another when there are biases in the testing of different claims? Okay, so triangulation is always about triangulating on one claim narrowly conceived. It is the case that mixed methods are also advocated at different stages of research or for different kinds of questions. Look again at the mixed methodology text, where the topic is designs with multi-level uses of approaches. I'm quoting from it again. Researchers use different types of methods at different levels of data aggregation. So I'm going to talk about vertical, but this is not the vertical I mean. That's why I'm reading this quote to you. Researchers use different types of methods at different levels of aggregation. For example, data could be analyzed quantitatively at the student level, qualitatively at the class level, and quantitatively, did I get back from? So it could be quantitatively at the student level, qualitatively at the class level, quantitatively at the school level, and qualitatively at the district level. So that's from the text again. And also, when they set forth what they call mixed model studies, which are, and I'm quoting them again, studies that combine the qualitative and quantitative approaches within different phases of the research process. Now, I urge a different need for mixing methods, a vertical mixing, not a horizontal one, and not the vertical mixing we've just been talking about. I think we need vertical mixing because scientific results cannot be turned into evidence without arguments, and the different premises and the requisite arguments will generally be very different in kind and concomitantly require very different kinds of methods to secure them. So I insist on mixing methods for claims up and down across the premises. Just consider my effectiveness argument. I think I have another copy of it. The first premise can be warranted, as the evidence rating systems insist, by good RCTs. Maybe the second could too, if only something that's impossible. If only one could do an RCT on the population here, now, at the time the policy is to be implemented, which then makes the policy prediction odious or unnecessary, useless. And we do have many other means for establishing premises like two. For instance, I'm not going to tell you what these means are. It's what we philosophers of science have been trying to describe for 200 years. For instance, we by now have overwhelming evidence that the pull of the Earth plays the same causal role in principles governing the orbits of the planets as it does in the principles governing cannonballs and dropped glasses. And clearly, premise 3 generally requires a good deal of local knowledge, and what the methods will be for learning if the helping factors are there or not will depend intimately on just what those helping factors are. So, look at Cooper again on the efficacy of homework. It takes a very different kind of study to know about student motivation than to know about how consistent the teacher's lessons are or how much family support there is. On the argument account, there's no warrant that a result is evidence unless there's warrant for supposing that there is a good argument, one with true premises. The most ingenuous way, the most honest way to define a warrant that there is a good argument is to show it, to lay out the argument and produce the warrant for the premises. That will require a variety of different methods attuned to the content of the different premises. Mixing them is not a luxury, but a necessity. If you aren't mixing your methods, you aren't doing warrant. To conclude, let me show you some pictures that illustrate tonight's issues and remind you of some slogans that summarize my theses. Pictures first. Advocates of evidence-based policy police what gets on the scale to weigh in favor of policy predictions. So, as we see here, they allow on the scale only claims that are very likely to be true. They vet for truth. So they've got very high standards. It doesn't get on the scale unless it's true. Very, very likely to be true. So they vet for truth. But they are poor guards on relevance. That's my word. I claim that we cannot just drop claims on the scale because they are true. Okay? They must be relevant. And their relevance depends on arguments. It is only once the argument is secured that the evidence claim can be cut loose, as we see here. Oopsie. Okay, cut loose as we see here, and then fall on the scale. Only then can it weigh in on the prediction. So I think there's a complete symmetry here between the strength of the demands for quality and for relevance. They won't let it on the scale to weigh in. The whole idea is, I think, that once you've said it's evidence, it's allowed to weigh in. So they won't call it evidence unless it's true. And I won't call it evidence unless it's relevant, for the very same reasons. I don't want it weighing in unless it really does speak to the conclusion. Okay. Now, so those are the pictures. And then in conclusion, I've got these slogans. I'm going to remind you of the slogans. Evidence equals premises and good arguments. And it's not evidence without evidence that it is evidence. Now, this account of evidence has real bite, and it should. We must not set our policies under the delusion that we have more evidence for them than we do. Okay. I have illustrated here with the issue of when RCTs, which are touted as gold standard evidence for these purposes, can serve as evidence that a policy will work here. I've urged that all the painstaking efforts that go into conducting a good RCT are only a very first step, a first premise. It takes a great deal more work and very, very different in kind before we are warranted in entering our RCT results as evidence in our policy deliberations. So, very brief conclusions. If you aren't doing argument, you aren't doing evidence, and most probably, if you aren't mixing methods, you aren't doing argument. After all, you can't build sturdy conclusions on shaky foundations, or shaky premises. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy. That was absolutely fascinating. I know there'll be some questions here from the audience. We'll take a few questions. I'm going to walk around with this portable mic, so please wait for me to come to you with a portable microphone. And for those of us watching on the webcast, we'll take a few questions in here, but then we'll go to our online audience in case there are any questions. So if you have questions, please do type them in, and we'll address them to our speaker. Okay, questions?
Thank you very much for that thought. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the idea of a set of evidence being as strong as its weakest link. I think of some cases in even the sort of random controlled studies that we talk about. If, let's say, you've got one of these random control experiments where one of the subjects of the experiment somehow contaminates the results from that particular subject. If the study is robust enough, in such a case, it wouldn't really matter if that one element of the set of evidence was problematic. The entire...
What do you mean by if the study is robust enough?
Well, if you've got multiple lines of evidence coming in to give you the conclusion in the study, and one of those lines of evidence is problematic for one reason or another, the study could still be useful in policy or in application, even if one particular part of it is problematic.
I don't see that. I mean, what kind of problems are we thinking about? So, when I look at a randomized controlled trial, because I believe in all this business about arguments, I want to write down what a trial is supposed to do, and I'd like to produce a deductive argument that shows that, and I can do this, and people do it all the time, that shows that if the demands for an RCT are satisfied, then it follows deductively that the policy or the treatment plays a causal role in the causal principle there. If one of those premises fails, of course, the conclusion could still be true, but you don't have the warrant for it that the RCT is supposed to provide. And that's many good match studies that have true conclusions and actually succeed in having an equal distribution of other confounding factors in the treatment in the two groups. But the people who, evidence-based policy people don't like that because they think they can't get evidence from one of the premises. So I've been buying that line. I want to see what the premises are that say what you can conclude from the RCT, and then I want to look to see whether or not you have more that premises are true. I think if the premises are not true, then if the premises that are needed to get that conclusion don't hold, you don't get the conclusion.
I see. And if you have a set which is redundant in some sense, so your sample size is bigger than it really needs to be persuasive, wouldn't this also be a case where it doesn't really matter if some little elements or parts of what's making up the argument as a whole are problematic?
Well, if you can construct another argument that says you do that all the time with attrition, for instance, right? You don't any longer satisfy the conditions for an ideal RCT. You think there's possibly a misbalance because people have dropped out and they've probably dropped out differentially in the two groups according to what other background causal factors they've got, and you make statistical corrections for that. And then what you do again, I think, is you write down the deductive argument, you describe the statistical corrections, you have as a premise that these kinds of statistical corrections are very likely to have restored balance, and then you draw your conclusion. So it's not that you can't use the information, it's that I want to see every time we try to use the information what the argument is that connects that trial under that description with the outcome that you're drawing from.
Question.
It does seem to me that you can't, that the RCT people, they can't have it both ways. They can't say that, we just won't allow, really. Match studies are always second-class citizens. Why? Because you can't guarantee I don't think you can in an RCT either. You can't guarantee the truth of the premise that you've got an equal distribution of causal factors in the background. That's why, if you can't do that, if all match studies are second class because you can't guarantee the truth of that premise, I think the same logic says that you better be able to have good reasons to guarantee the truth of the premises you do need.
I'd like to say a little more about that. You said several times that we form a deductive argument whose conclusion is that this causal factor is effective. But that's not how the statisticians talk about it. They pick a significance level, and if they get an effect above that level, they conclude that it's highly unlikely that you would have gotten this result if the treatment is not in fact effective. So tell me how this deductive argument you're talking about works, because I don't really see it.
Yes, so I was skipping over a phase and making things much simpler. The statistical arguments in the structure I gave, right? I said we have the premise that the effect size is larger in the treatment group than the control group. Now, how do we warrant that premise? We actually look at the finite frequencies of the outcomes in the treatment and control group. We look at the sample size, and we do exactly what you said. We try and figure out what is it highly likely? Is it highly likely that the average value here is higher than the average value there. We do it just the way you said, also doing some of these other corrections for attrition and things. So that is to say that one of the premises in the argument, the premise that the effect size is positive, that the average, the average with the true probability, the average is higher in the treatment group than the control group. So why do we believe that premise? Well, we believe it because we have theories of statistical inference that say, under certain conditions, it's very likely that from this data, the true probabilities are like this. So what you've done is describe the warrant we have for one of those premises. And I was just skipping to the premise because I didn't want to talk about statistical inference, I wanted to talk about causal inference. Statisticians don't make the distinction between coming up with a positive effect size and then making a causal claim from the positive effect size very often. So they come up with an argument that defends that you actually do have or don't have probably a positive effect size. From a positive effect size, what does that tell you about causation? So you need a second argument on top of that, which is the one I was talking about.
We'll have to talk about this there, because I still don't see a deductive argument for statistical premises to conclusions about causal effects.
So the deductive argument using the deductive argument using whether you want to be Fisher or Nathan Pierce or whatever, the deductive argument is going to be one that has as its conclusion a claim about the probability that we are within a certain distance from the true probability. That's an argument that you have a deductive argument for in statistical inference. That premise, that conclusion, supports a premise that says the effect size is indeed positive. And then when you've got so you have an argument over here that supports a premise for the argument over here. And the argument over here that comes up with, it's probable that you're within a certain distance of the true outcome, or whatever way you want to run the argument. That's deductive. And then you use that claim, I think, often fallaciously to say, well, that's good warrant that the true probability is bigger in this group than that group. And we always do. That's the standard problem of getting from the... that's the standard problem of statistical inference. You've got a story about whether it's how probable it is that you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of the true probability to claiming you've got the true probability. That's not deductive. That's an argument that goes from however you think it goes, but that's the argument that supports this premise here. So this premise here doesn't actually have a deductive argument behind it, because you've got an argument that's got probability at the bottom here, and it goes from the probability over here. And it's not even the probability you've got the true probability. Right? So,
thank you.
So there's most of this argument has been about being more exclusive, right? So excluding things that RCTs that are perfectly good inside themselves, but that don't have the right backup parameters to make them relevant. But you've given some hints that you also want to be more inclusive in the sense of including other kinds of evidence. Other than the so-called gold standard RCTs, and I hope that that's true, because otherwise it sounds like you're setting standards so high that you won't ever be able to get kinds of evidence that are adequate to policy decisions.
Okay, so can I comment on that? Well, first of all, my own view is that you don't have, you put things on the scale. You put things on the scale, and they may not be true. And what you have to do, and we don't have any formulas for doing this, but I kind of think of things as having two balloons. It's got a quality balloon, how probable is it, and a relevance balloon, how probably relevant is it, and how probably true is it. And that and that things are sort of partly on the scale, and when it comes time to figure out how much warrant there is for the hypothesis overall, one wants to look at all the pieces of evidence, all the pieces of putative evidence, and have this kind of complicated thought that, well, some of the evidence claims are likely not to be true, and some of them are likely not to be relevant after all, and that's just a complicated problem that we haven't got a clue how to do in a reasonable way. It was formally correct. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that because I'm keen on these arguments, there are good deductive arguments for being able to draw causal conclusions from lots and lots of other kinds of methods. So I do this. I can construct an argument that shows you that I can define what an instrumental variables model, a successful instrumental variables model is in econometrics, and show, with fairly uncontroversial assumptions about causality, that if, just as with the RCT, if all the assumptions are met, that a causal conclusion follows deductively. The reason people who favor RCTs don't want that is that many of the substances are substance specific. So they claim that with an RCT, all the assumptions are modeling assumptions. It's not true, but they claim that. Over here, with instrumental variables, or I can also give a totally separate set of conditions that, if they're met, standard econometric structural modeling will give causal conclusions. QCA will give causal conclusions if certain conditions are met. Process tracing will give deduction from theory. I'm having studied physics. So I like deduction from theory so all of those, but they have substance-specific assumptions that go in, and they're generally causal assumptions. Substance-specific causal claims go in, so that Judea Pro, like my slogan that says, no causes in, no causes out. So you have to put in some causal knowledge, and the people who do, most of the people who advocate RCT, we could never have the right kind of substance-specific knowledge. So why don't we look at the substance-specific knowledge we have in various cases and see whether it's very likely to be true or not, when one makes these claims. How dicey is that relative to the diciness of the RCT? And of course, often, sorry, I'm going on, but this is, often there's a trade-off, and it's the trade-off people, I think, sloppily say is internal versus external validity. But when you're doing the RCT, study population there, it's going to be relevant. What happened there is going to be relevant here only if the other two premises can be secured. Now, some of these other methods that have substance-specific causal information in many cases, the other premises that are needed to make them relevant to here will be more easily secured than the ones for the RCT. So it's when you get the whole thing laid out, right, it's not clear that you want to start out, well, again, it's not clear you want to start out with premise one you can really, really nail down, but make it very difficult to secure premises 2 and 3. And over here, premise one's a little bit more dicey, but it makes two premises 2 and 3 and 4 are easier to have good work.
Alex.
Okay, so you said it's no evidence unless there's evidence, it's evidence. And my way is that one could push that and say, well, we could push that into an infinite regress.
Yeah.
Say it's not evidence unless there's evidence, there's evidence.
That's exactly what I said. Yes.
So
that seems to me that's the human condition. There ain't no foundations to knowledge. You start somewhere, and the point is that, of course, not my view, right? That you stop somewhere. if you're lucky, you scope at places that you're fairly secure about. If you scope at things you're not secure about, you need to recognize that when you're trying to put things on the scale. Right? I mean, if you've got down, if you're like, you nailed down 9 premises and you've still got one you're totally unsure of, then you're not willing, you don't feel entitled to take for granted. Well, then the structure is shaky, right? And you have to, you can't let that claim weigh in as evidence because you don't know about its relevance. So you take that into that. So I wouldn't say that you can't put things on the scale unless they're true, and I wouldn't say you can't put them on the scale unless they're really relevant. I'd say that what you do what sensible people do, what one ought to do sensibly, is to try and keep track of how likely it is to be true, how likely it is to be relevant. It makes everything very complicated. I think that's life too. What the appeal of for the EPP movement is one of the reasons, as I started out saying, is that the idea was that if you could only tell policymakers what evidence is, and here's the evidence. You can go to the What Works clearinghouse now. There are clearinghouses. There are hundreds of clearinghouses now that have stored in them policies that work. That means policies that have been shown to work somewhere in a good RCT. And so the idea was that if you could, that none of us can do these calculations. I mean, there isn't a way to do the calculation. So let's do it for them. But I don't think that it can be done for anybody because you have to know what the evidence, what the evidence claim is, what the hypothesis is, what the arguments might be, and it's just complicated. And of course, most of the time we wing it. But I just think that you mustn't proceed with false confidence. Right? Oh, I took it off the shelf, and the U.S. Department of Education's What Works clearinghouse. I took this educational policy off the shelf. It's been vetted for high quality. That there's high quality evidence behind it by a really good team of experts who look to see that the RCT is well done. I just think that leads you to mistake. I mean, it leads you to overbidding your cards.
Question. So I think the last 2 answers you gave to Jillian and Alex's question is partly addressed what I wanted to ask as well, which is also about the evidence that weighs in. And if I've understood it right, I think the strong deductive methods that you're proposing are an important corrective to overusing these policies with confidence. But I wonder if you haven't swung a little too far in the other direction because in making them too restrictive. So in evaluating is the premise likely to be true, is this premise likely to be relevant, you want some kind of demonstration of truth and relevance. And in some cases, you may not have that, and then you want to withhold letting that weigh in as evidence. Yet, and that's our ignorance. It might actually be relevant, and it might actually be true, and we may miss important consequences that ultimately will determine whether this policy is going to be successful here or not. So, I guess, in the sense that you've already said, it's really complicated, and that's the situation. That kind of is the answer here. But I guess my worry is just that is this going to be too restrictive in equally, maybe not equally, but insofar as ultimately we want to know should we use this policy or not. And if we leave out important information, we could get just as problematic a decision as if we include the wrong things.
Well, that's just the claim I make about leaving econometric studies and only using RCTs, that they are plausible evidence. And you can look at it and think it's very likely that they're evidence, because it's very likely that they're true, and it's very likely that they're relevant. So I agree with you that we should, I think, you don't have to know something is evidence in order to take it into consideration in your argument. it could, what you do need to know is that you don't really know whether it's evidence or not, you don't really know whether it's true. You should keep that in mind, and moreover, where you can make a rough assessment. I think you're better off where you can to make rough assessments than not, and not pretend, not assume that it's relevant without understanding what it would take in order for it to be relevant, or not assume it's true without understanding what it would take to show it's true. So these guys have all been concerned with, don't assume it's true without understanding what it would take, or without us understanding and us telling you, right? So.
Yeah.
So it seems this sort of follows up on Julian's question. There's a way of thinking about the policy. No, Julian.
Oh, Julian.
Yeah, sorry.
I said Julian.
Yeah, no.
No, I didn't know Julian. Yes.
So
Alex, right?
Yes. So in terms of thinking about the evidence-based policy sort of predilection for randomized controlled trials, and you put that in terms of focusing on the assessment of whether it's likely to be true rather than focusing on the overall role it might play in an argument. There's a kind of interplay between what works in a randomized controlled trial and what's generalizable. What is something that you can, how you make arguments for the fact that it extends from there to here. And you alluded at the very end of the talk to, you said something about, well, in other cases in the sciences, we often are quite confident in our ability to generalize claims. Perhaps you were thinking of things we could deduce from theory or something like that, where we are comfortable making that move. And I was wondering if there's something specifically challenging about the kinds of cases in the social sciences that you're that block those other moves that have been successful in other areas of science.
I think it's just a vague thing to say, but I think we need theory. I mean, one needs to have. We need to have come up with the right set of concepts that will figure in regular connections with other concepts that those connections hold fairly widely. And coming up with the right set of concepts is really difficult. And I used as an example the medievals who were studying falling bodies, and you must know this case. So they in Oxford they were studying is objects fall. The further they go faster. They go faster. They're going faster when they've fallen further. Now we study dv dt. How does the velocity change with time? But they were trying to study dv dx. How does the velocity change with the distance traversed? And they couldn't find anything neat. I mean, that just isn't the right concept. That's not the concept that's causally operative. So that's just but the history of physics, the history of science is coming up with the right kinds of concepts that will give you more general principles. I think there's a kind of problem. Not only the social sciences have more controversy about theories and more the concepts that would be generalizable are, but there's a built-in problem when you're thinking about something like randomized controlled trials, because it's an important part, and quite rightly so, of the methodology that there be a highly specified protocol. Because if people in the treatment group are all getting different treatments, really, and people in the control group are getting different treatments, and we don't know any reason to think that the distribution of what they actually got was the same. So there's very tightly specified protocols, and also very tightly specified operationalizations, the best ones, for determining whether the outcome has occurred or not. So the outcome is precisely specified. Well, in my experience, in working in physics or in economics or social science, generalizable concepts are seldom those kind of precise operational ones that are specified in the protocol. That usually what you have is that there's something more abstract. That when you look at you think that it's forces cause motions. It's not being located in the area of the sun, or being located, a charged particle being located next to a charge. What's really generalizable is being subject to force. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow. So, so I think that one of the problems when you do the trial is you don't know what you're testing if you want to have a general claim. In one sense you do, because you've got a very strict protocol, and there's a big issue about fidelity. So there's a whole huge urging that if you're going to do the policy somewhere else, you should be faithful to the protocol. But I'm just saying things you're going to hear tomorrow. But being faithful to the protocol, since in social situations, the same doesn't usually mean the same. That doing exactly that over here, you're not at an abstract enough level.
So the benefits of being very precise and operationalizing concepts to use in the protocols cuts against the ability to discover generalizable concepts.
Yeah, those might not be the concept. You might actually have got onto something that's very generalizable, but you haven't got the right description of it.
Mm-hmm.
You can stay home tomorrow. That's one of the main points. I'm sorry, where? Oh, okay. So the microphone going. Kathleen, sorry.
You touched to some aspects of the question, but I saw in the literature on clinical trials that sometimes some statisticians, especially Bayesian statisticians, argue that you can make perfectly good controlled trials that are not randomized, and that the randomization only brings a very marginal benefit from the point of view of the interpretability of the result, but that can really hurt the patient. And I was thinking that perhaps there's something similar for the case of policy. Suppose we're trying new teaching methods for young students, it can really have a bad effect there. So is there something that is similar in the context of BBB?
Well, there's this dispute between Bayesians and non-Bayesians about the need to randomize. And independent of the Bayesian disputes, it's pretty clear that what randomizing does is it guards against not the general concept of statistical bias, but it guards against bias in the sense bias by the assigner and assigning people to the treatment and control groups. It doesn't guarantee that you've got an equal distribution. What it does do is guarantee that nobody is unconsciously or consciously putting the guys who are going to get better in the treatment group and the guys who are not going to get better in the control groups or the drug groups. But I'm not sure what more to say about that.
So what I really meant to ask is your account of evidence really strongly depending on classical statistical method?
No, I tried when talking to this person here to say, sort of, not describe what logic of statistical inference we were using in order to get to the conclusions about effect size. But I take effect size as about true averages, or is the true probability different in the two groups? And there are a variety of different. There's all the arguments about how you do that, and so I was trying to sidestep those because we were all brought up on those when you do philosophy of probability, and look at and move on from that to say, even if you knew, even if God told you that this really is a positive effect size in this population, so this treatment really appears in the causal principle that governs one of the causal principles that governs that outcome in that population. What can you do with that? Of course, we don't know that. And then if you have disputes about even how you would try, what would be the best way to find it out.
This isn't so much a question as a follow-up on Chris's point. or his question. One was local interest, but quite a few years ago now, we had a graduate student who was talking about EVM rather than EVP, but making quite similar arguments. At the same time that she was doing her graduate work with us, she was working in a clinical setting with seniors who suffered from multiple chronic diseases, and so none of the results were applicable to them. And what she argued in her dissertation was that this wasn't simply the absence of phase 4 trials, but the absence of theoretical knowledge, and in particular causal. She used your capacity arguments in order to explain why she thought that these were exportations that were in fact illegitimate. So it wasn't social science; it was medicine itself. But that was the same structure of argument that she had then.
Good. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, that's an argument that sometimes the way I put it is that people go from people do assume. They assume when they've done an experiment and seen a local causal truth, right, that they've established a capacity. Right. And you have...
But this is Robin Bloom, who's now at Untitled University. Yes.
I've been at conferences. I didn't know that she had that sort of...
No, it was exactly a capacities-based argument that she used to diagnose the problem.
We both were doing the capacities-based argument problem in parallel.
Yeah, exactly.
Where is Robin Bloom now?
Old Dominion.
Is there another question? Otherwise, I'm going to ask one. So. Okay.
You're also allowed to make helpful, constructive comments or fill in gaps in the argument.
Okay, well, this will be out too. Well, thank you very much for that talk. I really enjoyed it. I guess my question was sort of, what do you think that all randomized controlled trials ultimately are about addressing causal claims?
I have no idea. What I do know is how to use them to address causal claims. Whether other lessons you can get, well, there are lots of other lessons you can get out of them. And you can just draw pure statistical, and that's actually what Fisher was doing. Fisher was drawing, really talking about statistical inference issues, not causal inference issues, I think.
I mean, it seems to me that one often talks about a sort of tension in the design of randomized controlled trials, and at one end of a spectrum in terms of design possibilities, or what do we call explanatory trials that really attempt to get at causal claims. And I think the way you're talking about trials, it seems to me that that's the sort of trial you seem to have in mind, ones with highly specified protocols, ones that really very carefully address rigorously in highly specific terms the sort of treatment conditions, and ones that also characterize in very careful ways the study population and so on. So that sort of approach, it seems to me, is quite consonant with the way I hear you talking about trials. But trialists often speak about that kind of trial design being in tension with so-called pragmatic trials.
Yeah, sure.
They really aren't, it seems to me, about addressing causal claims. It's really about addressing kind of in-the-world decision-making. And of course, there's a spectrum that exists here that's complicated. But, so I guess my question is, why aren't these policy trials, or why can't we view these policy trials as being more the latter kind of trial, that really aren't about addressing a causal claim, but rather that are just trying to address a very in-the-world kind of question.
What's the question?
The question is, should we prefer, for example, policy A or policy B?
Well, I don't think I think they. On what grounds should we prefer it? I mean, is it that the grounds? So I think policy has a huge number of legitimate issues that go into settling it. Is it morally, culturally, politically acceptable? How much does it cost? How much do the alternatives cost? Will we get voted out of office if we do this, even though it might be a good thing? And I think that the trials are all just addressing, will it produce the results we want if we do it? And that's a causal question, whether you put it loosely or you put it tightly, whether you say we don't have to have knockdown, drag-out evidence to make a bet on it because it's cheap, or we have to do something and we've got more evidence in favor of it than something else. But I think that I don't know what a pragmatic study is doing if it's not addressing the effectiveness question as opposed to any of these other questions. You did.
So I'll give the last question to Bill.
Certainly, the policy using randomized trials, I really appreciate the worries about so it happened there, how do we know it will work here? What I'm finding in your answer to Jillian, you were talking about weighting, right, and your scales and
weighting is a metaphor, yes.
I know, but the point, but in many of your answers to questions, you were ending up, it was important to be able to assess things that aren't just a matter of a deductively valid argument of true premises. And your model of an argument, sort of premises and conclusion, really isn't doing a lot of work for you when you actually start looking at details. And I would suggest that you can probably, I'm not going to advocate that you should be a Bayesian, but it isn't clear to me. Every time it gets complicated, you end up really backing off from that model. And then you're using just pictures and stuff. And I think you could go further if you had some slightly more general stuff about this weighing and how these things fit together.
Yeah. I don't back off. I think what I think is that it's what you want to know is what's important is that you have to, the argument does play a role because you have to know about the truth of those premises. And then, since we don't know about the truth of the premises, we have to have some device, some epistemic device for thinking about what to do in the face of ignorance, and in the face that we have some reasons to think it's highly likely, less likely. I wouldn't want to be a Bayesian about those things because what I think is I have gained some ground because I know about the separate propositions I need, and I can think about them. I don't need to have a probability distribution over a whole big space. I need to assess. And that's why I don't want to use the word likely. I like the IPP, climate change people have very likely, not so likely, medium likely. No, I mean you could be a qualitative Bayesian. It's not that. It's that I want you to know what it is that you have to be committed to, and then you can think about how firmly you should be committed to that. And you can treat that, right, whatever devices you've got for dealing with ignorance. But I wouldn't trust, frankly, I wouldn't trust anybody who started doing a Bayesian story on it. Because the Bayesian story requires too much paraphernalia that I know I don't have, and moreover, it conceals what the logical structure is. But what you really need is. Yes.
So okay, I'm actually surprisingly finding myself sympathetic to this aspect. You need acceptance as a guide to the highly different research. And that's something that isn't just adjusting probabilities. Is that what you're saying?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't call them probabilities. I just think they don't have structured probabilities. They do. Well, at some point, several people said you need to decide whether or not to adopt the policy, and that will depend in part on an overall evaluation of how likely you think it is to be effective. So at some point, you plump for it's likely to be effective, it's not likely to be effective, it's likely not to be effective, it's likely to be effective, and but it's very expensive. So eventually, you do things that on the face of them look a little bit like cost-benefit analysis with real probabilities and real costs and benefits, but I think it's false rigor to pretend that you actually are doing it with probabilities. Nobody actually said that they minded that you can't, on this view, you can't have evidence. I mean, there isn't evidence unless, if all arguments are deductive, then there's never any evidence for something which isn't true. I mean, as soon as there's evidence, it's true. And I thought you were all going to mind that. Too polite to say this is just crazy of you.
Well, at the end of a really great talk and discussion period, I like today's, I often find myself thinking, I wish we had more. And I'm very good news. We do have more. We have a second Rotman lecture tomorrow afternoon. Professor Cartwright is going to address wiser use of social science, wiser wishes, wiser policies at 3:30 p.m. Here in this room and also on the same webcast. So please join me in thanking Professor Cartwright.